Hey, so welcome to another story time. This is the story of Native Son by Richard Wright. See, it's kind of a large book, um, but it's fantastic. So let's share the screen and get you right into the story of Native Son. So this is a race book. It's about race relations and civil rights. And I think it's important to know that this book was published in 1940. And as we think about civil rights, I think we think that like nothing happened until Dr. King or Rosa Parks or whatever. Rosa Parks in the early 50s and Dr. King in the 60s. But these issues obviously were always there. And Richard Wright is one of those who wrote about them long before the civil rights movement. Ralph Ellison as well, which we'll talk about in a minute, but he also has another book on the list called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which is another one. So I think it's important to know that. Let's talk about Richard Wright a little bit. There he is. You see his the years he was alive. He was interested in communism when he was a younger man in the 1930s, and this was before the Cold War, so didn't have the fear that was around the idea of communism after World War II during the Cold War. And there was some indications that the communist movement in the United States was more open to the idea of civil rights than the mainstream. He focused mainly on African Americans when he was a younger writer, but then as his later work kind of expanded to include all oppressed people, which is very interesting because Dr. King kind of does the same thing, right? After he gets the civil rights legislation of 64 and 65, he begins to talk about poverty, including white poverty as well. So Dr. King kind of followed what Richard Wright did as well. This book is very challenging, and I think you'll see why. So I hope I can do it justice in the few minutes that I'm here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. I'll try to stick to only what happens in the book, but I might stray into areas of things that I want you to think about while you're contemplating this book. First of all, I want to tell you this. Ralph Ellison says that the African American man in Richard Wright's novels, and including this one, really only has three choices. They can assume the role of passivity designed for him by Southern whites and kind of rely on religion to bring meaning to their lives. So this idea of submission to the culture that Southern whites has adopted. And we kind of see that now today, right? We see this controversy over the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, or even the Southern white culture of the Civil War and the monuments and things that are around. So you have the one choice is to kind of just accept that and live within it. The second choice is to strive for your own middle class life, which is separate from white middle class, and by doing so become an accomplice in the oppression of blacks by not engaging in the culture that in the oppression that exists. And the third choice is to reject the ideology that whites have created and imposed, and by rejecting that, almost resorting like what Ralph Ellison says here, assume the role of a criminal to disrupt the ideology of white supremacy, which usually results in violence. And that third choice is what happens in this novel. So the main character in the novel is a man named Bigger Thomas, and he's a 20-year-old African-American male. we don't really know like if why he's called Bigger, and the size of him is it changes throughout the course of the novel, but always in a figurative sense. So the physical largeness of Bigger doesn't really matter. It's really how he thinks of himself and how others think of him. And that's the significance of his name. I just want to read you the first section of the book where he wakes up here, and this is the beginning. Ring! An alarm clock clanged in the dark and silent room. A bed spring creaked. A woman's voice sang out impatiently, "Bigger! Shut that thing off!" A surly grunt sounded above the tiny ring of metal. Naked feet swished dryly across the planks in the wooden floor, and the clang ceased abruptly. "Turn on the light, Bigger." "All right," came a sleepy mumble. Light flooded the room and revealed a black boy standing in a narrow space between two iron beds, rubbing his eyes with the backs of his hands. From a bed to his right, the woman spoke again. "Buddy, get up from there. I got a big washing on my hands today, and I want you all out of here." Another black boy rolled from bed and stood up. The woman also rose and stood in her nightgown. "Turn your head so I can dress," she said. The two boys averted their eyes and gazed into a far corner of the room. The woman rushed out of her nightgown and put on a pair of steppins. She turned to the bed from which she had risen and called, "Vera, get up from there." "What time is it, Ma?" asked a muddled adolescent voice from beneath a quilt. "Get up from there, I say." "Okay, Ma." A brown-skinned girl in a cotton gown got up and stretched her arms above her head and yawned. Sleepily, she sat on a chair and fumbled with her stockings. The two boys kept their faces averted while their mother and sister put on enough clothes to keep them from feeling ashamed. And the mother and sister did the same while the boys dressed. Abruptly, they all paused, holding their clothes in their hands, their attention caught by a light tapping in the thinly plastered walls of the room. They forgot their conspiracy against shame, and their eyes strayed apprehensively over the floor. So you kind of meet Bigger and his family. His mother is there, his brother Buddy, his sister Vera. There's no father. Later in the book, we find out that the only thing we know about Bigger's father is that he was murdered in some sort of racist incident. And because of this, really the home doesn't feel like a home to Bigger. It's a horrible place, dirty, and you can see there when he wakes up here with the alarm clock. And time is going to be an important theme throughout this book. This time that wakes him up with this loud noise and the light that then shows the horrible conditions in which they live. And again, this is Bigger preferring to live in the dark, to live in sleep, to not see the conditions in which he lives. And he begins to think about, like, who's responsible for these conditions? Why is this family living in such conditions? And if it's someone's fault, if someone is responsible, then who is responsible for, I wrote retaliation here, but who is responsible for holding those people accountable? So if someone is holding someone down or punishing someone like a bully, who's responsible for stopping that bully? All of these things are put forth here at the beginning of the book. So there's a rat that comes out, and there's rats all throughout the house, and they're all afraid of it. Bigger kills the rat, and he terrorizes the dead rat. He terrorizes the family with the dead rat. His sister Vera, who's very scared, and if you look at the title of this first book, Fear, it's all about fear. Vera is very afraid of everything, and she faints at the sight of being taunted by this dead rat. And it's during this incident really that we find out that Bigger really hates his family. He hates that they're suffering, that they do nothing about their suffering. And yet he goes out to try to find a job for the family, to support the family. And I mean, so he has this oppression that like he has to get a job, not for himself and to support himself, but to support the family that he hates. And there's nothing wrong with his family. They're not like bad people or anything. You know, they don't just sit around or whatever. It's just that he hates these responsibilities, things that are tying him down and things that are holding him down. And so there's that dichotomy going on here with Bigger Thomas. He goes that night to the pool hall and he hangs out with his friends. And he reveals that that Bigger has this fear of white people. And he's afraid of what they might do to him. And this might be a sign of what might come. So while they're sitting around at the pool hall, him and his friends, they figure out that maybe we should rob white wealth. Maybe we should find some rich white people or some rich white business and rob them. He knows that he will never do this. He knows deep down that he will never actually take this action of entering a world which he's forbidden to enter, to get something that he is not allowed to have. But the idea of taking this from the white people is intriguing to them. They know, though, that if they do that, the police will investigate, but they also know that if they stole from black people, that the police would not investigate. And so there's this troubling understanding of what the world in which they live is like. So before they go to rob the white business, they decide to go to the movies. And while they're watching the movies, which is all about white people, and again, this book was published in 1940. I can't think of any African-American movie stars really before the 50s or 60s. So everything that's depicted on the screen is of white wealth. The problem is that him and his friends feel that they're equal to the people that they're seeing on the screen. So imagine that, like imagine feeling and knowing that you are just as smart or just as good a person as the people that are on the screen, but you will never have access to the things that they have access to. They also are moved by the simple depictions of African Americans, and this one kind of stuck with me. There's one of my heroes for many reasons is Louis Armstrong, and I'm not sure if you know him, famous jazz musician from New Orleans, right about this time, right, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even. He's successful into the 70s, all those decades. Even in the 20s, I think he has some things. Anyways, when the movies start, and Louis Armstrong was very famous, there's one movie that they put him in. Now, when we think of jazz music, I think a lot of people like point to Louis Armstrong as the father of American jazz. And, you know, I could talk about that for a long time, but I'm not going to. But I did include a video clip here that is from a movie, and you got to skip ahead, you know, like halfway in. And you'll see that these movie people put Louis Armstrong, again, this, like, one of the greatest musicians that ever lived. And they put him in a costume to make him look like, you know, he was from the jungle, like simplistic. And it's just hilarious to me that here are these white people making these movies who cannot comprehend the genius of the man who has dark skin. And so they place him in this uniform, this costume, to, I think, try to put him in his place. But obviously the skills of who he is shine above whatever they put him in. And so I think that's hilarious. I think it's something that he recognized what he was doing, Louis Armstrong, when he did this, with that you can put me in whatever costume you want me to be in, but that's not going to define who I am. And we'll talk about that. So if you want to watch that clip about Louis Armstrong, you can and see what I'm talking about. But this is kind of what attracted Bigger Thomas to these simple depictions of African Americans. Um, so after the movie, Bigger and his friends go back to the pool hall because they're going to rob someone, but instead, Bigger attacks his friend Gus, and he brandishes a knife and tries to humiliate Gus by making Gus lick the blade that supposedly he's going to stab Gus with, but he's not. Obviously, after this incident, they do not go rob the white business, and it's because Bigger does this on purpose. He creates the situation that will help him not have to go rob, because he doesn't really want to do that, but yet he kind of does. But it's all about his fear of what's going to happen. Anyways, the next day, Bigger gets a job with a family called the Daltons, the white family. They're nice people. They're capitalists. They own businesses. They're rich. They give a lot of money to the NAACP for African Americans, try to help African Americans. But at the same time, they also own the rat traps like the ones Bigger lives in. Mrs. Dalton is blind, and it's both figuratively and physically. They cannot see that what they're doing by having housing like this, housing conditions like the ones they own, and by ripping the African Americans off, by making them pay rent for these pieces of junk that people live in. They cannot see that what they're doing, even though they give money to the NAACP, they're really holding the African American race down in the United States. So the Daltons are is a very interesting couple of characters, and we'll get to them we'll get to them more. The Daltons have a daughter named Mary, and the first thing that Mary asks Bigger is, "Why aren't you a member of a union? Shouldn't you organize and be a member of a union?" As if this was a thing for African Americans in the 40s. And this kind of just shows you like how uninterested in reality the Daltons are. They live in their own world, and they think everyone lives in that world. And so when someone comes into their world who doesn't have the same experiences, they cannot understand what's going on. Bigger then talks to the African American housekeeper named Peggy, and Peggy's like, "Stay away from Mary and her friends. One thing is they're communists." Again, communists they weren't looked upon as great people, or they weren't highly respected in the 1930s and 40s. But there wasn't the fear around communism as that comes into the United States in the 1950s. But still, Peggy says stay away from them. Bigger has his own room in the Dalton house, which he's never had before. And so it looks like things are heading in the right direction for Bigger. He's got a job. He's got his own room away from that rat trap that he used to live in with his family. And the Daltons are at least nice, you know. That night, Mary says, "Why don't you drive us, me and my boyfriend, Jan, or Jan, I'm going to call him Jan, around." And so he does, and they go to parties, and they go to the park and things. And Bigger realizes that he's just their chauffeur. Like there isn't like, "Hey, be our friend, come and meet our friends." He was like an object to them, like a way for them to show the world that they're not a racist, even though that's exactly what was happening. He was treating Bigger like an object. You can see here what I wrote. Mary and Jan, very condescending to him, like pretending like he's stupid and all of these things. They get a bottle of rum, Mary and Jan do, and they drive through the park and drink it while Bigger is driving them. And they're so drunk by the end of the night that Bigger has to carry Mary into the house. And he's carrying her in and hoping that no one sees this because of what they might think is going on. But they get into Mary's bedroom, and Bigger looks down at her and is like, this has been a forbidden thing of a black man kissing a white woman, and how can I pass up this opportunity? And so he gives her a kiss, even though she's like passed out and whatever. Just as he is kissing her, Mrs. Dalton enters the room. Now, if you remember, Mrs. Dalton's blind, so she can't see what's going on. But Bigger is so afraid of what she might think or see. And just then, Mary starts to wake up and make some noises. And so Bigger puts a pillow over her head to kind of keep her quiet. And Mrs. Dalton rolls over and smells the liquor and is disgusted and kind of rolls out. And Bigger's like, glad that's over. And he takes the pillow off of Mary and discovers that he killed her. So he doesn't know what to do. And unlike the beginning of the book, you hear the loud noises of the clock of kind of like, wake up, wake up, wake up. There's no booming of clocks anymore. It's more, you can hear the ticking of the clock, like time is up, or there's only a few seconds left. So Bigger comes up with this plan. He's going to burn the body of Mary in the furnace of the house and tell people that she probably went off to Chicago with Jan. And so he is putting the body into the furnace. I just want you to read this section of what he does. He looked into the furnace. Her clothes were ablaze, and smoke was filling the interior so that he could scarcely see. The draft roared upward, drowning his ears. He gripped her shoulders and pushed hard, but the body would not go any further. He tried again, but her head still remained out. He wanted to strike something with his fist. What could he do? He stepped back and looked. He closed his mouth and swallowed. Oh, then the cat comes in. He got his knife from his pocket and opened it and stood by the furnace looking at Mary's white throat. Could he do it? He had to. Would there be blood? Oh, Lord. He looked around with a haunted and pleading look in his eyes. He saw a pile of old newspapers stacked carefully in a corner. He got a thick wad of them and held them under the head. He touched the sharp blade to the throat, just touched it, as if expecting the knife to cut the white flesh of itself, as if he did not have to put pressure behind it. Wistfully, he gazed at the edge of the blade resting on the white skin. The gleaming metal reflected the tremulous fury of the coals. Yes, he had to do it. Gently, he sawed the blade into the flesh and struck a bone. He gritted his teeth and cut harder. As yet, there was no blood anywhere but on the knife. But the bone made it difficult. Sweat crawled down his back, then blood crept outward in widening circles of pink on the newspapers, spreading quickly now. He whacked at the bone with the knife. The head hung limply on the newspapers and the curly black hair dragging about in blood. He whacked harder, but the head would not come off. He paused his stack. Okay, I'm not going to go on, but you kind of get the idea of what he has to do. He has to cut off Mary's head to fit the body into the furnace. So he does that, and there's implications here of, so he does this to a white girl, but what have whites done to blacks figuratively throughout forever up to this point, right? They have not really appreciated what's in the brain of the African American, what's in the head. They've decapitated the African American race for centuries. And so there's some dichotomy there. But Bigger goes home and sleeps. And this time he kind of feels bigger. He feels like he has some power. Even though all of this was like an accident, like he wasn't a killer, but yet he was, And so even though most of the first part of this book is called Fear, and it talks about everyone's fear of white people, that seems to be going away. And this gets us into the second part of the book called Flight. Bigger has a girlfriend. Her name is Bessie. And she thinks that she hears about the disappearance of Mary. So no one knows that Mary's dead yet. So they just think she's not there. And this is helped by Bigger, because he tells the story to the private detective, as you see there. Tells about what happened in the night and how he thinks that Jan and Mary were going off to Chicago or whatever. But Bigger knows that he's not the same person, and you get that idea from reading the book, that he's a changed human being, that there's something different about him, and he knows he is, and he's afraid about, like, is he acting different? Can his family tell that he's different? Can other people tell? Can his friends tell that he's different? And he realizes that, the acting that he's trying to act normal, which is a little difficult for him, but then he realizes really he's been acting his whole life anyways. He's never been really exactly who he is. He's always been what other people thought of him or thought he should be. But he so wants to tell people about what he's done. And he's almost proud. He almost feels like a Superman of what he's done. He's been able to, like, strike back at people who have tormented him and his people for a long, long time. And so his stature in his own note is increasing. And so he thinks of the second part of this plot. He's going to write a ransom note. It says someone has kidnapped Mary, and slips it under the door of the Daltons. And the Daltons then call the police, give it to the police, and the police are involved. And the Dalton house is, there's people all around investigating and talking to people and all that. And it gets a little cold, and they're like, hey, Bigger, can you go restart the fire in the furnace? So he goes down there and he starts to try to clean it out, and he knows he's just so afraid of what's about to come out. And so he's trying to work fast, and there's dust flying everywhere of the ashes that's in the furnace. And there's some reporters who are mad, like, well, why are you just let us do it? And they pull out some bones and an earring. And so they know that this is Mary's body now in the furnace. So there's some interesting things here. They know that if Bigger's the one to blame, being a black man, an African-American man, that there's no way that white people would consider it just a murder, that they would assume that the black man would have raped the white girl before he killed her. And yet, if you remember, this is all still like an accident. Like, he didn't mean to kill Mary, and it just kind of got out of hand here. He doesn't feel responsible. Or maybe he does feel responsible. It's just, he's very confused here. But he has to tell someone, so he tells his girlfriend Bessie from the beginning to the end of what happened, and flees to Chicago. And by fleeing, everyone kind of knows that he's the one who did this. And so in the newspapers and in the communities, he's hated by both whites and by blacks. By whites because he killed this white girl, and by blacks because he has, they say, discredited the race. And then if you think back to those three opinions, or those three choices at the beginning of this presentation, he doesn't feel that way. He doesn't feel, he feels like if he hadn't done this, then he would have like been submissive to the wishes of the whites and all that. And so now there's this huge manhunt in Chicago, house by house. I forget how many thousands of police officers are searching house by house, both white and blacks, to try to find Bigger. And they're on the run. And they feel like the rat that Bigger killed at the beginning. His girlfriend is like freaked out, scared to death. Paralyzed by fear is the phrase they use. And so Bigger has to start to carry her, and realizes that Bessie's just holding him back and holding him down, just like everybody else has been holding him down. And so he grabs a brick and kills her while she's sleeping, and dumps her body down an air shaft. And so here are these two people who kind of showed interest in him, Mary and Bessie, and he's killed them both. he realizes that the only money he had was in Bessie's pocket, and so he's broke. He's got no money, but yet he feels so powerful and so strong, and so not chained down. In fact, there's the great scene when he finally gets caught. He's on the top of a building looking down on the white people. And then it's the white cops who drag him down again. Again, just some great visuals that Mr. Wright puts in here. And then he gets back to prison. And the prison that he's in is not much different than the ghetto that he lived in before. And again, this kind of makes us think about who's, if the ghetto, the house that he lived in with his family is like a prison, then who is responsible for that? And then we get into book 3 then. It's called Fate. So Bigger is in jail now, and he begins to face reality that he's not going to make it out of this. And really part 3 is really struggling with this concept between who created Bigger. Is Bigger responsible for himself, or is there a culture and society who helped to shape him to be who he was? And this is really a very difficult thing for anyone to think about, right? So we try to think that our decisions are made by ourselves, like we can decide what's right and wrong and do what's right and wrong and live with those consequences. But there's a lot of people who think that, how you see the world and how you act is kind of based on the world in which you grew up in. So this is very interesting. I want you to really think hard about that. Are you who you are because that's how you chose to live, or are you who you are because of the world in which you grew up? And if it has to do with the world in which you grow up, maybe there's a balance, but if it had anything to do with the world in which you grew up, are there things that you are doing that are holding people down? Are there things that you are a part of? Or are there things that you aren't doing to stop the oppression? And if you're not doing anything to stop the oppression, are you just as guilty as those who are causing it? All of these things are explored in part 3 here. Bigger has an attorney named Max, who, again, much like the other people, especially the other white people, who are trying to help, but don't look upon Max, or don't look upon Bigger as a human being, but look upon him as an object that they can work on. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So again, Bigger kind of accepts his fate, but is it a fate that he was doomed to before he was even born? And if that was the case, then again, who is responsible? He does at the end of the book. He gets this will to live again, and there's a scene when all of the white people are there in the prison to visit with Bigger, and it's kind of like a lineup almost. It's kind of a reverse lineup of who amongst these people is responsible for the fate of Bigger Thomas. And it's just a great scene that he writes about here. But I want to read just the last conversation that he has with Max, his lawyer, at the end of the book here. This is Max, the lawyer, talking to Bigger. Bigger, you're going to die. And if you die, die free. You're trying to believe in yourself. And every time you try to find a way to live, your own mind stands in the way. You know why that is? It's because others have said you were bad and they made you live in bad conditions. When a man hears that over and over and looks about him and sees that his life is bad, he begins to doubt his own mind. His feelings drag him forward, and his mind, full of what others say about him, tells him to go back. The job in getting people to fight and have faith is in making them believe in what life has made them feel, making them feel that their feelings are as good as those of others. Bigger, the people who hate you feel just as you feel, only they're on the other side of the fence. You're black, but that's only a part of it. Your being black, as I told you before, makes it easy for them to single you out. Why do they do that? They want the things of life, just as you did, and they're not particular about how they get them. They hire people and they don't pay them enough. They take what people own and build up power. They rule and regulate life. They have things arranged so that they can do those things and the people can't fight back. They do that to black people more than others because they say that black people are inferior. But bigger, they say that all people who work are inferior. And rich people don't want to change things. They'll lose too much. But deep down in them, they feel like you, Bigger. And in order to keep what they've got, they make themselves believe that men who work are not quite human. They do like you did, Bigger, when you refuse to feel sorry for Mary. But on both sides, men want to live. Men are fighting for life. Who will win? Well, the side that feels life most. The side with the most humanity and the most men. That's why you've got to believe in yourself, Bigger. So this is Max talking about it's on you. You know, there are these bad people, but there's a thing that you can do. And he just doesn't get it. He's like, if you only did this, then if you only did this. So then Bigger ends the book this way. Mr. Max, you go home, I'm all right. Sounds funny, Mr. Max, but when I think about what you say, I kind of feel what I wanted. It makes me feel I was kind of right. Max opened his mouth to say something and Bigger drowned out his voice. I ain't trying to forgive nobody, and I ain't asking for no one to forgive me. I ain't gonna cry. They wouldn't let me live, and I killed. Maybe it ain't fair to kill, and I reckon I really didn't want to kill. But when I think of why all the killing was, I begin to feel what I wanted, what I am. I didn't want to kill, but what I killed for, I am. It must have been pretty deep in me to make me kill. I must have felt it awful hard to murder. What I killed for must have been good. It must have been good. When a man kills, it's for something. I didn't know what I was really alive in this world until I felt things hard enough to kill for him. And it's the truth, Mr. Max. I can say it now because I'm going to die. I know what I'm saying real good, and I know how it sounds, but I'm all right. I feel all right when I look at it that way. Max's eyes were full of terror. Several times his body moved nervously as though he were about to go to Bigger, but he stood still. I'm all right, Mr. Max. Just go and tell Ma I was all right and not to worry none, see? Tell her I was all right and wasn't crying none. And that's how the book ends. We don't really see or hear about Bigger's death, but he's going to be executed. And so he doesn't really feel guilty about what he's done. And this is difficult, especially for white people reading this novel, is they want him to feel bad for what he's done. And so I want you to think about these things, like who is responsible for Bigger Thomas and the condition and the situation that he was in. I don't know if you're familiar with the term white privilege, but maybe I'll try to put a link in what white privilege is. But sometimes being as a white person, we don't quite understand what it means to be white and the privilege that we get just by the color of our skin. And so this might be an opportunity for you to look into that and see if you think there's any truth in that concept of white privilege. And I wonder if you think about like the death of Mary, what would have happened to Bigger Thomas if like he found Mary dead and then just went to the authorities at that point? Like would there have been any different in how he ended up if he had just turned himself over at that moment and told people it was an accident? I think that's something important to realize, that, you know, probably at the end of the book, when he's executed, would probably have been the same thing, even though it was an accident. And so as we think about these things, is violence a solution? You know, you can think about that, why or why not, that's a solution. If you're interested in this issue of race, I hope you watch the movie Malcolm X. It's a fantastic movie with Denzel as Malcolm X, and he struggles with this concept as well. We know that Dr. King says that violence is never a solution, but there's people who don't always agree with him. And I want you to think about these two terms too. This concept of dehumanization, like how do we dehumanize people? And Max was looked at as a black man throughout the entire novel or as an object, or not really a human being with his own unique personality and dreams and wishes and idiosyncrasies and all of these things. And one of the ways that we dehumanize people a lot in our world is by essentializing them, by giving them characteristics based on the things that they are. So, like, if someone says, I'm a Democrat, well, then we have this idea of what a Democrat is, and we attach those ideas to them. That's the essentialization process. We boil things down to these strict, rigid things that we define people as. If you're a woman, then we essentialize you. Here are these things. If you are a Muslim, if you're a Catholic, if you're a teacher, you know, there's all these essentializing that we do. And every time we do that, we dehumanize someone because we take away who they are as a human being, as an individual. And this is what happens to Bigger Thomas throughout the entire story, right? He's essentialized. Meaning is given to him by people rather than allowing him to define himself. And the process of essentializing another human being is in itself dehumanizing. And so maybe those are issues you can struggle with as you analyze this book. I suggest that, you know, if you have some time, to go ahead and read some Richard Wright, or at least you know of him, and you know about this book called Native Son, which is fantastic. I really look forward to your analysis of this, and maybe some of the other books about race that are on the list if you're focusing on that. But always feel free to ask me any questions about anything I've told you about. Oh, let me tell you one more thing. So I put that video of Louis Armstrong where he's dressed like the way he is, but I've also put another video in there that you may want to look up if you're interested in Louis Armstrong and jazz music or whatever. But he has a song that became famous called Black and Blue, and I would love for you to just listen to that song and listen to the lyrics. And I just wonder what the white people who heard him sing that song were thinking, and why they may or may not have done anything about it. So all that's there for you. Good luck, and I'll see you next time.